Hold on. Hold on. Did you just say you're declaring independence? Yes. From me? Yes. After everything I've done for you? You mean the taxes? I mean the protection from the French, who you also fought with our money. This is a lot. I know. Okay, new plan. We're doing this the hard way. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is how the most powerful empire on Earth ended up at war with 13 colonies that, a decade earlier, were just colonies, loyal ones, boring ones even. So how on earth did this relationship implode so badly? Grab a drink, this is going to take a while. Let's set the scene. It's the 1760s. Britain has just finished a massive war against France, a war that, conveniently, was largely fought to protect its American colonies from French expansion. Britain won. Britain also went catastrophically broke doing it. We're talking national debt doubled levels of broke. So Parliament looked at the situation and came to a very reasonable conclusion. Hey, you know who should help pay for the war we fought to protect you? You. So you want us to pay taxes to a government we have no representatives in? Correct. That seems like it might cause problems. It will be fine. Are you sure? It will be fine. It was not fine. First came the Stamp Act in 1765, a tax on basically every piece of paper in colonial life. Newspapers, playing cards, legal documents, even dice. Every single one needed an official stamp which you had to pay for. The colonists' response was immediate, loud, and extremely well organized. Mobs of protesters, calling themselves the Sons of Liberty, intimidated tax collectors into resigning, sometimes by showing up at their houses at night with torches and strongly worded opinions. So the tax collector just quit? All of them, every single one, in every colony. How? Turns out, people don't love opening their front door to an angry mob holding torches and asking very politely if they'd consider a career change. Fair. Britain backed down on the Stamp Act within a year, but immediately turned around and tried again with a new set of taxes on glass, paint, paper, and tea, known as the Townshend Acts. The colonists responded the same way they always would: boycotts. No British goods at all. Colonial women organized spinning bees to make their own cloth instead of buying British textiles, turning homemade clothing into a political statement. Drinking smuggled Dutch tea instead of British tea became genuinely an act of patriotism. So drinking tea is now political. Drinking the wrong tea is political. This is going to escalate, isn't it? Oh, absolutely. To enforce all this, Britain sent troops to occupy Boston, a city that, by this point, despised them. Thousands of armed soldiers crammed into a town of about 16,000 people, competing with locals for jobs in their off hours and generally being about as welcome as you'd expect. The tensions simmered for almost 2 years until, on a cold evening in March 1770, a dispute between a wigmaker's apprentice and a British sentry escalated into a crowd of colonists surrounding a small group of soldiers, throwing snowballs, ice, and oyster shells. Sir, the crowd is getting larger. How much larger? A lot larger, and they're throwing things. Hold the line. Do not fire. Sir, someone just got hit with a chunk of ice the size of a gunshot. In the chaos, shots were fired. 5 colonists died. Within days, propaganda prints were circulating throughout the colonies depicting it as a deliberate massacre of innocent civilians by a brutal occupying army. And whatever the messy truth of that night actually was, the story that spread was the one that mattered. The Boston Massacre became a rallying cry. Things simmered for a few more years until Britain handed the colonists their next gift-wrapped outrage, the Tea Act of 1773. On paper, this one actually lowered the price of tea. The problem was, it did so by giving one specific company, the East India Company, a monopoly on tea sales in the colonies, while still keeping the hated tax in place. So in Boston, a group of colonists disguised themselves, rowed out to 3 ships loaded with tea, and spent the night dumping the entire cargo into the harbor. So just to clarify, they didn't steal the tea. No. They didn't sell the tea. No. They just destroyed an enormous quantity of extremely valuable tea on purpose as a statement. That's the one. And Britain's response to that is going to be measured and proportionate, right? Ha, no. Britain's response was the Coercive Acts, a package of punishments so harsh that even colonists in other colonies, who had nothing to do with the tea incident, looked at what was happening to Massachusetts and thought, okay, that could be us next. Boston's port was shut down entirely. Massachusetts' local government was effectively dissolved and placed under direct royal control. And in a final, almost comically tone-deaf move, British soldiers could now be housed in private colonial homes, whether the owners liked it or not. This backfired spectacularly. Instead of isolating Massachusetts, it united the colonies. In September 1774, delegates from 12 of the 13 colonies gathered in Philadelphia for the First Continental Congress, essentially a support group for colonies that had all individually concluded, yeah, our relationship with Britain is not going well. So what's the plan? We send a strongly worded letter. That's it? It's a very strongly worded letter. Okay, but also, we tell every colony to start organizing militias and stockpiling weapons. Just, in case? In case of what? In case the strongly worded letter doesn't work. Spoiler, the strongly worded letter did not work. By April 1775, British General Thomas Gage had heard reports of weapons stockpiles near the towns of Lexington and Concord and decided to send troops out under cover of darkness to seize them quietly before anyone noticed. Quietly being the operative word, because colonial writers, including a silversmith named Paul Revere, had an extensive early warning network specifically designed to make sure quietly never happened. Sir, the message has gotten out. The whole countryside knows we're coming. How is that possible? We left at night, in secret. With respect, sir, you marched 700 men down the main road, in formation, with drums. Did we bring the drums? You insisted on the drums, sir. At dawn, the British column reached Lexington and found a small group of colonial militia, Minutemen, already lined up on the town green. Nobody knows for certain who fired first. What's certain is that within seconds, 8 colonial militiamen were dead, and the war that everyone had been pretending might not happen had very much started happening. The British pushed on to Concord, where the fighting escalated dramatically. Colonial militia, now arriving by the hundreds from surrounding towns, engaged the British at a bridge and forced them to retreat. And then came the worst part of the British day, the long march back to Boston, harassed the entire way by colonial fighters firing from behind stone walls, trees, and barns. By the time the British limped back into Boston, they'd suffered nearly 3 times the casualties of the colonials, and Boston itself was now surrounded by an angry, armed countryside. So, what's the situation? We're besieged, sir. Besieged by farmers. By farmers with muskets, sir, yes. How many farmers? Several thousand and growing every day. Right. Send for reinforcements, and maybe don't mention the farmer part in the report. In June, the British attempted to break the siege by seizing the high ground overlooking Boston. The resulting Battle of Bunker Hill, technically fought mostly on the adjacent Breed's Hill because history loves a good mix-up, saw waves of British troops marching uphill into withering colonial fire, twice being repelled before finally taking the position on the 3rd attempt. It was, technically, a British victory. It also cost them over 1,000 casualties to take a single hill from part-time soldiers. We won! We did! Why does everyone look so upset? Because we won cost us more men than most entire battles, sir. Let's not do that again. Agreed. Around this time, a Virginia planter and former militia officer named George Washington was appointed to command this new Continental Army, mostly because he was one of the few people everyone could agree on, and because, frankly, he looked like a general, which counted for a surprising amount in the 18th century. Through the rest of 1775, the siege of Boston dragged on until Washington pulled off a brilliant logistical stunt, hauling heavy artillery captured earlier from Fort Ticonderoga over icy mountain roads to fortify the hills above Boston. Faced with cannons pointed directly down their throats, the British evacuated the city entirely in March 1776. First real American win of the war. But independence still wasn't official. Many colonists still hoped for reconciliation. That changed fast, thanks largely to a pamphlet called Common Sense, written by a recent immigrant named Thomas Paine, which argued, in plain, blunt language anyone could understand, that the whole idea of being ruled by a king across an ocean was frankly kind of absurd. It sold an enormous number of copies relative to the colonial population, and it pushed the conversation from, how do we fix this relationship, to, why are we even in this relationship? By July 1776, the Continental Congress had drafted and approved the Declaration of Independence, a document that spent its opening lines on lofty principles about equal rights and government by consent, and then spent the next several pages absolutely roasting King George III with a long, detailed list of grievances. How's the document coming? Mostly done. We've got the philosophy section and then a list. A list of what? Everything he's done wrong, specifically, by name. It's quite long. How long? 27 items, sir. 27? We may have gotten a little carried away. And just like that, on paper at least, 13 colonies became one country. The hard part was making that stick. Britain's answer arrived that very summer in the form of the largest expeditionary force the empire had ever assembled. Over 400 ships and tens of thousands of troops descending on New York Harbor. Washington's army, badly outnumbered and outmatched, was crushed at the Battle of Long Island and only escaped total destruction thanks to a lucky fog that covered their nighttime retreat across the river. What followed was a brutal slide. New York fell. Then came the disaster at Fort Washington, where nearly 3,000 American soldiers were captured in a single afternoon, a wound so painful that to this day, most retellings of the war politely speed past it. By late 1776, the Continental Army was a shrinking, freezing column retreating through New Jersey, with enlistments due to expire at year's end and morale somewhere underground. Sir, morale is not great. How not great? Half the Army's enlistments end on December 31st, and most of them are planning to just go home. Right, okay, new plan. Another new plan? We're going to do something incredibly stupid, and if it works, they'll call it genius forever. That something was Trenton. On Christmas night, 1776, Washington loaded roughly 2,400 men into boats and crossed the ice-choked Delaware River in the middle of a brutal nor'easter. No bridges, no usable roads, just freezing water, sleet, and an army that hadn't been paid in months. Remind me why we're doing this on Christmas? Because the Hessian garrison across the river is currently very drunk and not expecting us. Oh, okay, that's actually smart. Don't sound so surprised. The crossing took most of the night, with men freezing and boats nearly capsizing in the ice. But by morning, Washington's force hit the garrison at Trenton completely by surprise, capturing nearly 1,000 Hessian soldiers in under an hour with barely any losses of their own. In terms of raw numbers, it was a small battle. In terms of timing, it might be the single most important win of the entire war. It kept the revolution alive at the exact moment it was about to quietly fall apart. So, we won? We won. With an army that was about to quit at midnight? With that army, yes. Maybe don't let anyone know how close that was. Way ahead of you. A follow-up victory at Princeton days later sealed the momentum shift. Enlistments rebounded. The cause didn't look quite so hopeless anymore. But Britain wasn't done, not even close. Their next move would set up the single biggest turning point of the war. The British plan for 1777 was, on paper, elegant. Send an army down from Canada along the Hudson River to link up with forces from New York City, slicing the rebellious colonies in half. In practice, it went differently. General John Burgoyne marched south from Canada with an enormous baggage train, famously including his personal wine collection, because nothing says swift campaign like hauling carts of champagne through the wilderness. Meanwhile, the British force that was supposed to meet him from New York went to capture Philadelphia instead, leaving Burgoyne completely unsupported. So, just to confirm, General Howe is not coming to support us. Correct. He took the army to Philadelphia instead. Correct. Are we going to be fine? Define fine. A Burgoyne's increasingly isolated, supply-starved army stumbled into a series of battles near Saratoga, New York, harassed constantly by colonial militia who knew the terrain far better than he did. The actual fighting genius on the American side largely came from a hot-headed general named Benedict Arnold, who at this point in the story was still very much one of the good guys. Sir, General Arnold has been relieved of his command. He's not authorized to lead troops. Understood. He just led a charge directly into the enemy fortifications anyway. Of course he did. After weeks of fighting with no relief coming and no way out, Burgoyne did something no British army had ever done before. He surrendered. His entire force, over 5,000 men, laid down their arms. This is the moment everything changes. France, still smarting from losing a huge chunk of its empire to Britain a decade earlier, had been quietly funneling weapons and money to the Americans for years. But a full alliance with French soldiers and the French Navy? That was a much bigger gamble, until Saratoga proved the Americans could actually win a major battle outright. So they beat an entire British army in the open field and forced a surrender. That's what the report says. Get Franklin a better coat. We're signing a treaty. But before any of that help arrived, the Continental Army had one more nightmare to survive. The winter of 1777-78 at Valley Forge. No major battles happened there. That's almost the point. It was cold, disease, and starvation, with men going without shoes in the snow, while smallpox and typhus killed more soldiers that winter than any battle had. And yet, this is also where a Prussian officer named Friedrich Wilhelm von Steuben showed up and, despite barely speaking English, basically rebuilt the Continental Army from scratch through sheer relentless drilling. He doesn't speak English. Correct. And he's going to train the entire army? Correct. How? Aggressively, mostly through yelling and demonstration. American military discipline starts here, doesn't it? Yup. By spring, an army that had nearly frozen and starved walked out of Valley Forge as a genuinely professional fighting force, just in time for France's entry to completely change the board. The next few years dragged the war south into Georgia and the Carolinas, where the fighting got uglier and more personal, neighbor against neighbor, brutal raids, towns burned. But the strategic endgame was forming in Virginia at a small tobacco port called Yorktown, where British General Cornwallis dug in his army, expecting the Royal Navy to resupply or evacuate him if things got bad. What he didn't expect was for the French Navy to arrive first, defeat the British fleet, and seal the harbor completely. Sir, the French fleet has arrived. Good, good. Wait, ours or theirs? Theirs. And ours? Currently losing off the coast right now. So we're surrounded by land and by sea, sir, yes. Washington and the French army marched south and surrounded Yorktown completely, tightening the siege day by day until Cornwallis's options shrank to zero. On October 19, 1781, the British army at Yorktown marched out and surrendered, with their band reportedly playing a tune called "The World Turned Upside Down," because apparently even 18th century soldiers understood dramatic irony. So that's it? That's the war? Officially, no. They're still fighting elsewhere, and the peace treaty won't be signed for 2 more years. But Britain just lost its second entire army to surrender in this war, public support back home has collapsed, and Parliament is about to vote to stop funding the fight. So that's it. Yeah, that's it. In 1783, the Treaty of Paris was signed. Britain formally recognized the independence of the United States, the very thing that, less than a decade earlier, had seemed like an act of pure madness scrawled onto parchment by a group of lawyers, farmers, and printers with no army, no navy, and no money. What started as an argument over the price of paper and tea ended with an empire sitting down at a table to formally admit in the most polite legal language available that it had lost a war to its own former subjects. So, we're really doing this. We're recognizing them. We are. After everything, after everything. Tell them happy birthday, I guess. I don't think they want to hear that from you. Fair enough. The end.